of it. That's the other sticking point very often in the past.
It's being suggested that this has come about, these incidents have come about because of intense hatred in certain parts of the world about the United States policy on the Middle East. But that policy is hardly likely to change now, is it?
We would assume not, I think. And whether it is singly about that, of course, is another issue. And of course, at the moment, this is all still in the realm of speculation, whether the Middle East is the fulcrum of all this. I mean, there are others suggesting that this is a much bigger platform, if you like, for the terrorists who've been involved in this, that it is much more anti-Western, anti-capital and so on, in addition to whatever also may be particular issues of the Middle East or indeed any other specific region of the world.
Mike Wardridge, thank you very much. Let's go to New York now. We can get the latest situation from our correspondent Steve Evans, who's in fact in one of the World Trade Center buildings when the first explosions took place. Steve, first of all, can you bring us up to date on the situation downtown?
The situation is that the rescue work continues. There are artificial lights up. Many of the streets of Manhattan have been closed off so that ambulances can go from the tip of Manhattan, where the World Trade Center was is the important word, out to the hospitals. Buses are being used here to ferry people. There are some casualty figures coming out. It is estimated that at least 200 firefighters are thought to have been crushed as these two buildings collapsed. Something like nearly 100 police officers are also thought to be missing. When I was down there, what was noticeable was the emergency services arrived swiftly and in force. About a half an hour after the explosions, there were lines of ambulances in the streets immediately underneath the World Trade Center. Nobody thought that those buildings were going to collapse. What has clearly happened is that those buildings did collapse. We know that, and they collapsed on many of the people who'd arrived there to rescue the people who died, the people who'd been injured in the initial explosions. After those collapses, you saw lots of firefighters absolutely caked in dust. They looked like moon-like figures. It's the only way of describing it. Now, those were the lucky ones. Those were the ones who got away. Clearly, an awful lot of those emergency workers didn't get away. We can't estimate what the final death toll will be. There are clearly the people involved in the initial incidents, if that's not too kind a word to use, and then many people then caught as those buildings fell.
Steve, we were looking just a second ago at pictures, nighttime pictures of New York, and the streets largely deserted in some parts of town, even in Midtown, and also shelves in a store largely swept clear of food. Is there a sense of panic still in Manhattan?
I don't think panic is the word, you see. It is eerie. It's almost heart-lifting, if you can have anything heart-lifting in this kind of circumstance. The shops closed almost in sympathy. A lot of shops closed. An awful lot of people simply got out of town, but quite a lot of people simply stood around ruminating about this thing. I was in Times Square a short time ago, and Times Square is normally, it calls itself the crossroads of the world. It is normally teeming with people right through the day and night. And there are small groups of people there looking up at the electronic ticker tape, which is giving the latest information. And they were quiet, but they were also angry. And it has to be said that the word vengeance was being used. The people I talked to, a few individuals, but the people I talked to, all said they hadn't been impressed by President Bush 24 hours ago, but in the speeches he's made since the bombings this morning, they are now impressed, and they were basically saying that whatever he wants to do, that he would get their support. The networks here are talking about America under attack. They're talking about it being like Pearl Harbor. They're talking about an event that galvanized a people. Various people have been talking about vengeance, about revenge, not just on the people whose hands have almost literally got blood on them, but the people who harbor those people. There is certainly an appetite in this city for some kind of military action.
Stephen Evans in New York, thank you very much.
This is BBC News, a summary now of the main story. President George Bush has acknowledged that thousands of people were killed in the series of attacks in which hijacked airliners were flown deliberately into landmark buildings on Tuesday. Speaking from the White House, President Bush said the victims' lives had been ended by evil. He said world leaders would stand together to win the war against terrorism.
It's a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world.
The devastation began when two hijacked passenger planes flew directly into the sides of the twin skyscrapers of the World Trade Center during Tuesday morning's rush hour. Both towers caught fire immediately and later collapsed, sending clouds of dust and billowing smoke into Manhattan as people frantically tried to escape.
The police officer told everybody to form a human chain, and we held on to each other, and he flashed a light, and he directed us to Building 5, and we went out Building 5.
You see people bleeding, and what did you see?
Oh, everybody could see. You want blood? Here's blood. Everybody's bleeding. People are laying all over the floor. It's horrible. And I was there the first time, and this is twice.
Shortly after the first two strikes, another hijacked Boeing passenger plane crashed into the Pentagon building in Washington, the headquarters of the American military. The building burst into flames and part of its five-sided structure collapsed. A fourth airliner crashed in Pennsylvania, again after apparently being hijacked. More than 14 hours after the attacks began, the full scale of the loss of life is not known. Nearly 270 people are known to have died in the four hijacked aircraft, and union officials in New York say several hundreds of firefighters and policemen have disappeared. Many of them are believed dead. US government sources say 800 people died in the Pentagon alone. In the last few hours, New York's Mayor, Rudolph Giuliani, advised New Yorkers to stay away from the city centre if at all possible.
It's important and it's critical, then you come to work. But if you can stay home tomorrow, you're going to make things easier on yourself and easier on the city if you stay home. So the city is not officially closed. Manhattan is not officially closed north of 14th Street. But we're advising people if you can stay home, it would be better. Outside of Manhattan, you go to work and do all the things you would normally do. There's no particular reason to be constricted in activities there. But if you can stay out of the city, that would be good.
International leaders around the world have condemned the attacks, among them the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat and the Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon.
I believe that together we can defeat these forces of evil. At this most difficult hour, all Israelis stand as one with the American people.
First of all, I am offering my condolences, the condolences of the Palestinian people to the American President, President Bush, to his government, to the American people for this terrible act. We are completely shocked, completely shocked.
Meanwhile, American forces around the world have been placed on the highest alert and warships have been deployed along the US East Coast. Suspicion has fallen on Islamic militant groups, including those associated with the Saudi exile Osama bin Laden, already wanted by the Americans. The Taliban authorities in Afghanistan, where Mr. bin Laden is based, say he didn't have the capability for such a huge operation. Many world governments have also ordered defense alerts and called emergency security meetings.
Well, why did it happen and what happens next? Earlier, I spoke to Jonathan Clark, Research Fellow in Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Research Institute, who's an expert on American foreign policy, and Anjem Choudary, leader of the British political party Al-Muhajirun, which attracts young British Muslims with its own brand of radical ideas. Mr. Choudary says, although everyone's deeply sorry for the victims and their families, it's no surprise that the United States has become a target.
We regret the loss of any innocent lives, whether we be Muslims or Christians. This is something which is unacceptable. Those people who are not involved in war, who are not perpetrating any violence anywhere in the world, they do not deserve to be targeted. However, we can get an indication of the feeling of the Muslims worldwide by the fact that if you go to Baghdad or you go to Jerusalem today, you'll find that people are celebrating in the streets. That will indicate to you that there is a feeling of retribution or revenge against American atrocities being committed at the present time in the Middle East.
American atrocities?
American atrocities being committed. For example, their continued support of the tyrant state of Israel, the continuing bombing of Iraq, the unilateral bombing indeed a few years ago of Sudan and Afghanistan. We have a long list of atrocities which America have committed, which are enough for the Muslims and the Islamic movements worldwide to consider that they are in fact in a state of war with the American government.
Jonathan Clark, in Washington, it seems this has come about because it's payback time for America's foreign policy.
Yes, that may be the case, but I think one of the things that does stand out today has been the number of messages flowing in from the Arab world, from all over the Arab world, and from Mr. Arafat himself, deploring this incident, condemning this as an outrage, and really dismissing any participation in this by the Palestinians. So I think that's an encouraging sign.
Anjem Choudary with us here in the studio. This is just a surely solitary act by a group of extremely radical fanatics who have no real base of support anywhere in the world.
I don't think that's the case at all. I think that the
well,
regimes...
you just heard, hang on a second, Mr. Jonathan Clark just pointed to the number of messages of condolence that have come in from Middle Eastern nations.
But the Middle Eastern nations are run by tyrant regimes, and they have dictators who have nothing at all to say about Islam, and they don't base their policies upon the divine text. Those people who represent the views of the Muslims and Islam worldwide are those legitimate scholars, and fatwa have been issued, for example, by the Sharia courts of the UK today, that American military personnel and buildings and war machinery remains and has been, up until today, a legitimate target because of atrocities which they have been committing.
Jonathan Clark in Washington, do you think this appalling attack is going in any way to change America's policy towards the Middle East?
Well, I think what is going on right now is a period of rational and calm reassessment. The United States policy in the Middle East has been very consistent for over a large number of administrations. I very much doubt that it's going to change in the face of this outrage. But clearly what you are going to be seeing is inside the American government a reconsideration of American foreign policy around the world. But I don't think you're going to see dramatic changes, especially not in the face of this type of provocation.
Anjem Choudary, it's not going to change anything. Thousands of people will have died for nothing.
I think that whoever was behind the actions which took place today are not really the focus point for us. I think what we need to do is we need to look to why people are targeting American interests. Why have people taken the stance that we need to attack the Pentagon, we need to attack the political and the economic and the strategic locations, and really inflict damage upon the American government. And I think it's got something to do with the fact that America continues to have their forces in the Middle East. America continues to back tyrant regimes, and I think that this should be a lesson not only for the American regime, but also to the Muslims worldwide, to say that we need to have a different type of relationship, a relationship based on debate and discussion.
Jonathan Clark in Washington, is America going to learn the sort of lesson that Mr. Choudary wants it to?
I think he's rather exaggerating the present relations between the United States and the Arab world. Generally speaking, these are very good. If you think about relations with countries like the Gulf Emirates, with Saudi Arabia, with Kuwait, I think with Egypt, you see a very great sign of friendship and solidarity with those nations. There are obviously major disagreements over Israel, but I think that overall the relationships with the Arab world are good, and they're not going to change as a result of this. So I wouldn't take this out of perspective in terms of American foreign policy. I really wouldn't. I think that this is going to continue in the way that American foreign policy towards the Middle East has been set for a great number of administrations.
Well, joining me now from Washington is James Woolsey, director of the CIA from 1993 and until 1995. Mr. Woolsey, what went wrong?
Well, we don't know for sure. Clearly this was not picked up, and it was a terrible tragedy. American intelligence has been successful in stopping a number of terrorist incidents back around the time of the year 2000 and the like.
You had warnings,
you have to stop them all.
You had warnings, didn't you?
It's hard to say. They may well have had warning that something generally bad was going to happen, but certainly not enough specific warning to realize it was going to be something like this. You remember a few weeks ago, we had to cancel some military exercises in the Mideast and put some ships to sea in the Persian Gulf to get them away from potential terrorists. There was a lot of talk then that something major might happen, but this may well have been what that talk was about.
Do you think you've been too busy worrying about Russia and missile defense systems?
No, I don't think that's the focus. That has very little to do with really most of what the intelligence community does these days. I think the major problem really was that for the 8 years of the Clinton administration, most of the bureaucracy got used to, under the administration's lead, to assuming that terrorism was either conducted by sort of loose associations of people who came together for a specific event, or by Osama bin Laden, or one of the major terrorist groups, but they did not look hard at state sponsorship. And this operation may have been sophisticated enough that people may now start to look hard at whether a government such as possibly Iraq, which is the one government that has praised this undertaking, may be involved. I think the Clinton administration did not look closely enough at that possibility, and hopefully the Bush administration now will.
Well, you seem to be blaming the Clinton administration. Surely Bush's stance and his isolationist stance and his siding with Israel, for example, should have alerted people to hostility in the Arab world at least, if not elsewhere, even in your own backyard.
Well, the hostility from the Arab world has been around for a while. I don't agree that President Bush is isolationist. I think that it's not certain that this attack came from the Arab world or the Mideast, although it seems to be a strong possibility given all of the circumstances, and particularly given the similarity to two previous operations that Ramzi Yousef, the mastermind of the World Trade Center bombing, who's in prison out in Colorado, conducted. The World Trade Center bombing itself in '93, and an effort to blow up a number of American airliners in the Pacific a year or two later. If, as some of us have been suggesting, there's a chance that Yousef was involved with Iraqi intelligence, that would also suggest that we should take a very hard look, certainly not proven yet, but we should at least take a look at whether there could have been Iraqi involvement in this as well.
We saw earlier John Ashcroft giving a web address for the CIA. Has he had any response from intelligence services around the world yet?
I don't know. I'm a private citizen and have been for 6.5 years, so I don't know.
But would you imagine that he's calling around, for example, and trying to get some indication of who might have caused this?
Well, certainly the intelligence services with whom we work closely on matters of this type, British, Israeli, and others, and some of the moderate Arab states, would have long ago, I think, have given us anything that they could have picked up that would have been potentially indicative of something like this coming. But after the fact, one has to go back and comb through every last detail and see whether or not anything was missed, and if so, what was missed, and to try to put the pieces together. There's a good chance that, as some of the leaks now here in this town are suggesting out of the White House, that bin Laden's group was involved, but that does not mean that they exclusively were involved. It is at least possible that there was a state sponsorship behind them.
So what do you think the CIA and the other intelligence agencies will have learned from this?
Well, one thing I hope they learned is that some guidelines that were adopted by the CIA, I hasten to say after I left, in response to a political issue here involving Guatemala, may have been most unwise. Those guidelines make it difficult, not impossible, but more difficult than it should be, to recruit spies inside organizations if those individuals have some violence in their background. Well, that may be well and good if you're recruiting spies inside hostile governments. There are a lot of good people trapped inside bad governments. But inside terrorist organizations, the only people there are human rights violators. They're people who want to be terrorists. So if you only recruit nice people as spies, you're not going to learn a lot about what's going on inside terrorist organizations. I think some of those types of guidelines that the CIA operates under now will get a second look. I hope a tough second look.
James Woolsey in Washington, many thanks for joining us. Well, evidence from people who died on several of the hijacked aircraft is being compiled by the FBI as it begins its investigation into the attacks. The American Attorney General, John Ashcroft, says a passenger on the plane, which crashed into the Pentagon, rang her husband twice on her mobile phone. She is reported to have said that hijackers armed with knives took control of the airplane. The FBI has been handed a recording of a conversation between emergency service controllers and a passenger who reported a hijacking on board the 4th airliner, which crashed in Pennsylvania. The controllers lost contact with the man shortly after he reported an explosion and the cabin filling with smoke. Sometime later, eyewitnesses on the ground saw the airliner flying low, upside down, and with its undercarriage retracted before it crashed into a wooded field. An American senator says the FBI is also examining tapes of conversations allegedly between the hijackers and their controllers. Well, worldwide condemnation of the attacks has been swift, and so too have been the denials of guilt. Those responsible will have had money and resources available to only a few terrorist organizations, and the focus of the investigation into America's worst breach of security will inevitably fall on Islamic and extremist groups. As George Eakin reports, it'll be those responsible for previous attacks on US interests around the world who'll come under closest scrutiny.
To some, the horror and carnage inflicted on the United States today is a cause of celebration. This was the Arab quarter of Jerusalem, where many showed their approval of a day of unprecedented terror in America's backyard. A claim of responsibility was reported from one Palestinian group, but then swiftly denied. The Palestinian leader condemned the attacks.
We are completely shocked, completely shocked. Unbelievable.
Investigators hunting the organizers will first consider these were airborne suicide missions on a scale not seen since the Second World War.
I think it's almost impossible to believe that a hijacker could convince an American domestic airline pilot to commit suicide by flying into the World Trade Center. I have absolutely no doubt at all they had trained pilots. We know in the past that they've had pilots who have been perfectly capable of flying aircraft, and this can only be the only, I think, answer to this. American pilots would not do this, but Arab fundamentalists may well be prepared to.
And it's this wealthy Arab fundamentalist that American officials are already naming as an immediate suspect, Osama bin Laden. He controls and finances Al-Qaeda, an umbrella network of Islamic militants, and he's vowed to destroy the United States. Bin Laden is accused of masterminding a string of attacks, including the US embassy bombings in East Africa 3 years ago, which killed more than 200 people. In retaliation, the Americans fired cruise missiles at training camps used by bin Laden in Afghanistan. They put a $5 million price on his head and led a worldwide crackdown on Al-Qaeda. Afghanistan's ruling Taliban, which continues to offer bin Laden sanctuary, insists he isn't capable of carrying out attacks like today's. But bin Laden is suspected of involvement in the last attack on the World Trade Center 8 years ago. 6 people died when a bomb exploded in an underground car park. His associate, Ramzi Youssef, was jailed for that and for plotting to blow up a dozen American airliners over the Pacific, a plan which in some respects foreshadowed today's terror. While the possibility isn't being excluded, no one's suggesting that the devastation of such high-profile international targets like the Pentagon and the World Trade Center is domestic terrorism. The sophistication of today's attacks with highly trained perpetrators and their synchronization to occur within 2 hours point towards months, if not years, of preparation. Does all this mean, then, that a rogue state might be involved? Some experts are skeptical.
Countries have realized that as governments, their involvement in terrorism has cost them more than it's gained them. And so there are very few countries left who are in the real terrorism business. Obviously, some governments fund groups that may conduct terrorist acts, but that's very different than actually providing government support for it.
State condolences flood in, yet it seems highly unlikely, if not impossible, that the biggest and bloodiest terrorist operation ever could have been planned and prepared without a single government around the world even noticing. George Eakin, BBC News.
And some news just in from Pakistan, where a newspaper used by the Saudi dissident Osama bin Laden has published a statement in which Mr. bin Laden has denied involvement in the American attacks. However, the Afghanistan-based Islamist said he fully supported the attacks. Well, President Bush promised to find those responsible and bring them to justice. Bill Hayton looks at his options.
The wreckage at the Pentagon is still being cleared and the human cost still being counted. The horror inflicted on bases and embassies around the world over the past 2 decades has now hit America's highest military headquarters. The sheer might controlled from this building has made direct military attacks against the United States all but impossible. Instead, its enemies have turned to so-called asymmetric warfare, small-scale operations with dramatic effects, such as last year's bomb attack in Yemen against the USS Cole.
And I think it's got something to do with the fact that America continues to have their forces in the Middle East. America continues to back tyrant regimes, and I think that this should be a lesson not only for the American regime, but also to the Muslims worldwide, to say that we need to have a different type of relationship.
Washington has responded with court action against those it believes responsible, but also with direct military retaliation.
And I have no intentions of discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
When Osama bin Laden's group bombed the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania 3 years ago, killing more than 220 people, the response was dramatic. More than 80 cruise missiles were fired at sites in Afghanistan and Sudan, allegedly connected to his organization. They killed 20 people but missed bin Laden himself. The actual bombers were extradited to the US, and last May, 4 men were convicted in New York and sentenced to life in jail. But retaliation doesn't always hit the right targets. In 1986, after 2 American soldiers were blown up in a Berlin nightclub, US planes bombed Libya, though it was later suggested that Syrian agents had been responsible. And Washington is being sued for millions of dollars by a businessman whose Sudanese factory was destroyed by a cruise missile after it was wrongly linked to bin Laden.
If they reflect on these questions and if they look at the source of the resentment in the Arab world and Muslim world, I believe there wouldn't be any attack. But sending cruise missile, it wouldn't solve the problem. It will maybe fuel more problems to the American and to the whole international community.
The USS Enterprise is sailing to join another carrier group in the Gulf, projecting American power into the heart of the Middle East. But political leaders must now decide whether using that power makes further attacks more or less likely in the future. Bill Hayton, BBC News.
The events have been described as America's second Pearl Harbor. Such was the disbelief and horror at the terrorist attacks. Let's take a look back at some of the images and reactions from eyewitnesses.
I was close to the window. It was unbelievable. I'm coming down 6th Avenue. All the traffic was running up. And I'm looking up, I'm trying to call the station, trying to find where we are. And I look up and the tower just starts crumbling down. And everybody in the street just stops and started crying and bawling. And I'm standing next to a fireman, he said, yeah, they just bombed the Pentagon too.
Yes, I was in the traffic on the 14th Street Bridge, right at the Pentagon, tied up going into town. And I heard this plane come over my head. It was really low.
What size plane?
It sounded like a small plane, but it was very, very low. And the next thing I know, there was this tremendous explosion as it hit the Pentagon. I looked over, and the smoke started coming up. Pieces of the plane and pieces of the Pentagon were falling onto the 14th Street, onto the Shirley Highway.
It was terrible. It was terrible. A tragic day today.
This is BBC World.